Republican of Kansas, is back here on the show. Welcome, sir.
Brian, good to be with you. Quite a news week, isn't it?
It really is. I mean, it's never a dull moment, and it feels like it's going 100 miles an hour. We spent a lot of the first hour talking again about the border crisis. I know that it has come again into stark relief with the murder of that University of Georgia student and other violent crimes being committed by illegal immigrants. And I just wonder, as you look at this debate moving forward, we've got the president finally heading back to the border. He's gone once ever in his 50-year political career. He was bullied, basically, into going down there, saw nothing of real consequence. They cleaned everything up for him. Now he's going to go back day after tomorrow to Brownsville, which is not exactly the center of the action, but he'll be down there. He's not committing to seeing any migrants. He didn't last time. I just wonder what you think the point of this visit exactly will be, aside from, A, just the optics of him feigning interest in this crisis to try to deal with a political problem and stop some of the bleeding, and B, my prediction, just so you know, Senator, I think he's going to go down there. I think he's going to lay out some new executive orders to make it seem like he's doing something. I know he just told us he couldn't do anything more on his own. That was never true. That was a lie. So I think he will do some executive stuff, and he will take the opportunity to blame, frankly, people like you for not passing the Senate immigration bill, and then he'll jet out of there. That's my prediction. I wonder what you think of it.
Yeah, Guy, I think number one is that this is his admission of guilt. So when he goes down there and says, here's the executive actions I'm going to do, I'm going to start reversing those 90 executive orders that I did to open the border to start closing it, that's his admission of guilt. Absolutely. Number two, he is going to go down there and blame Republicans. But the good news is your listeners are smarter than that. They know that there's 10 million people that have crossed the border illegally, that is a result of Joe Biden's policies. He could have stopped them yesterday. Guy, we are seeing an explosion now of human trafficking. Besides the fentanyl poisoning, the human trafficking is now exploding across a state like Kansas. It's coming to a place like you. The violence, the crime are all exploding as well. Wherever, my dad, the police officer, said wherever there's drug trafficking, the violence will soon follow. It'll take a decade to rid the country of the crime that's come across this border. You mentioned Laken Riley and her tragic death. That's but one example to remind your listeners. Joe Biden paroled 200,000 Venezuelans the past 3 years. 200,000 people from Venezuela. He flew in on Americans' taxpayer dollars and paroled them. And the vetting, I think, was minimal. This is just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, and you could say, okay, well, here's one of them allegedly committing that terrible murder. And then you had the other ones assaulting NYPD officers. There was a whole group of them doing that. Then there was the man who was just arrested and charged in Virginia for raping a child, also a Venezuelan national who came into the country illegally. You can say, okay, that's starting to add up, but it's still a very, very small number of the larger number of Venezuelans who were paroled in under Biden's policy. It's like, okay, even if it's a fraction of a percent, how many of these violent attacks from wildly unvetted people are acceptable? And it's a question that they never want to answer. And they would say, well, none of these crimes are acceptable, but you would never know it from their actual actions, from their policies at the border, and in many cases, their policies on crime as well, which let, for example, the alleged killer in Georgia get away with multiple crimes with virtually no consequence before he then murdered someone. Do we lose the senator?
Guy, now I got you back. I'm not sure what's going on. I apologize. But
no worries.
To your point, we've become a lawless society. We have open borders, cashless bills. We defund and disrespect the police. We do the smash and grab. We turn our backs. We have become a lawless society, and that's in Kansas City, a week and a half ago, celebrating the Chiefs' victory in a day of excitement, and celebration turned into a day of tragedy. And I think a big part of that is the lawless society we live in. You look at Kansas City, Missouri, their numbers, their violence, their murder cases going up. Kansas City, Kansas, they're going down. And the biggest difference is on the Kansas side of the border that they're enforcing the law, that there's a respect for law and order. The DA there means business as well. And here in Kansas City, Missouri, we have two gangs get together. One person means mug another gang member. I didn't know what that term even meant. Mean mug. You give somebody a dirty look, and young men pull out guns and start shooting in a crowd, and a woman tragically dies. So we have plenty of violence problems in our own country without the Venezuelans coming. But to your point, we've become a lawless society.
Since you mentioned Missouri, one of your colleagues from Missouri, Senator Eric Schmidt, he put out a very interesting infographic, and this is focusing specifically on the San Diego sector. So the southern U.S. border is broken up into multiple sectors. One of them is the San Diego sector, of course, in California. And since the beginning of the fiscal year, so over the last 4 months or so, there's this map of the world showing the top 10 countries from which people are entering San Diego sector illegally. And you look at Mexico, it's 18,000, Guatemala, 5,000, Peru, 4,000, Brazil, 8,700, Ecuador, 7,700, Guinea, Africa, 5,000, Turkey, 6,100, India, 5,000. I mean, all over the world, Senator, they're coming to the U.S. border. Then you get to the top two, Colombia, at least in our hemisphere, 28,000. And then a story that has been really growing in terms of the attention it's getting, including even from mainstream sources like 60 Minutes and CBS News, 21,000 Chinese nationals coming in through that sector alone in the last 4 months alone, a huge, steep increase. And on one hand, Senator, I don't blame people stuck in communist China for wanting to come to the United States. I would too. But on the other hand, you can't come here illegally, which should be obvious, but seems like it needs to be said over and over again these days with this crew in charge. But also, we can't cross-reference really anything with the Chinese government when it comes to vetting some of these folks. And the number of military-age single men from China showing up and entering illegally, I mean, at the very least, that's another major cause for alarm. It might give some people pause, even folks who might have sort of blown off the border crisis up to this point. What's going on there?
Right. Yeah. So, Guy, 2 points. The reason the Colombian population is exploding is that the same gangs that have ran the the cocaine for decades, are now making the fentanyl precursors. For today, most of the fentanyl precursors are coming from China. The China mafia runs the fentanyl to the cartel in Mexico, but now the Colombians are starting to make it. It's much less expensive to make the fentanyl than it is cocaine. And then the point on the Chinese, what's happening, maybe I mentioned earlier, is that human trafficking is exploding across the country as well. Wherever you were seeing fentanyl poisoning and drug trafficking, we're now seeing human trafficking. I think that China is probably behind most of that. I've yet to prove it, but that would be my guess, is that these Chinese nationals, you mentioned, I think, 20,000, over 40,000 have come in the past 2 years, 40,000 Chinese nationals. And then on the end of the fentanyl process, the Chinese in America are collecting the dollars from the cartel and maybe converting it to crypto and shipping it back to China. This is a very complex organized crime ring that we're dealing with.
Senator Marshall, here in Washington, D.C., I think most voters probably aren't even aware, although it's like, hey, is there a cliff coming up or a government shutdown coming up? It's a safe answer just to always say yes, because the way that governance works for the last number of years, that's just how it always is. So I checked, and there is a partial government shutdown due to start as soon as this Friday for some of the funding that goes away, and then the rest of it would come into play the following week. So you guys are up against it again here. What are the dynamics, at least in the Senate? How does this get resolved? Will we avoid a partial government shutdown? What are you seeing and hearing on the Hill?
Right. So I think what's important for your listeners to understand is, just like Joe Biden wants this crisis at the border, Joe Biden and Chuck Schumer want to leverage this threat of a government shutdown so they can control the purse strings. They want this pressure. They want this crisis. If they get us back into a corner, they think that they can write the appropriations bill. So they can take all this hard work that the Budget and Appropriations Committees have done, they can throw it out the window and say, here's what they call an omnibus. They bring all these 12 packages of funding together. Then they're going to throw on there the Ukraine funding, and then the FISA reauthorization. We're anxious to see what they're going to do with that. They'll try to cram it down our throat at 2 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday when America is not watching. So that's their goal. Remember, that's their goal. I think that right now, the only lever we have left is over on the House side, that Speaker Johnson, if he renews last year's funding, it's called a continuing resolution at last year's levels, we end up with a 1% cut. If we can continue that resolution past April the 30th, it's really budget gimmicks that numbers we agreed upon, months ago. Some cuts would kick in, resulting in $100 billion of savings. It's the least of the evils in front of us. I think that we'll see some type of a continuing resolution. I don't know for how long. I'm sorry, that's more complicated than it needs to be.
No, that's why I asked the question. But do you think it's likely? Do you think a CR would come out of the House and would be accepted by the Senate?
I think it will. That the leadership in the Senate and the House both think shutting the government down is the end of the world. Look, I would prefer to keep the government open, but we are ignoring the normal budget process. We do not follow the deadlines that are in law. The president should have submitted next year's budget in early February, and we still haven't done this year's budget, which is why we're looking on a long-term fix to go back with some type of teeth and punish the executive branch if they don't do their budget, punish members of the Congress if they don't do theirs. So you get this, but we are between a rock and a hard place. This is no way to run a business
or a country, and yet it's how we do it apparently here, and it's a mess, and it's very frustrating, and it's also par for the course in the current modern political era. And I guess we'll see how this one is at least temporarily resolved, perhaps in the next few days, in the next few weeks. U.S. Senator and Dr. Roger Marshall, Republican of Kansas, our guest.